This next poem is Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes, which offers another very negative depiction of war. Like Owen, Hughes highlights the reality and the horror of war. In particular, the terror of an individual's perspective during a charge in battle. Unlike Owen, however, this is an imagining of a soldier's experience rather than a first-hand account, because Hughes himself never saw direct combat. We'll read the poem and think about its context. We will annotate it, paying attention to the language and form. And finally, we'll think about which other poems you could compare it to in the anthology. Suddenly he awoke and was running, raw in raw-seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air. He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. In bewilderment then, he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running. And his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot-slashed furrows threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide open, silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet toward the green hedge. King, honour, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue crackling air, his terror's touchy dynamite. So what's the plot of this poem? In this poem, we see a soldier thrown into battle unprepared. It's so startling an experience that he feels like he's been jolted awake, and we are shown his advance in the chaos of battle. During this charge, the soldier hesitates, contemplating his own role in war, and in the midst of the chaos, a hare gets thrown up in front of him, and the soldier witnesses the suffering of this animal, an innocent bystander, as the result of the war. It makes him run in terror, presumably resuming the charge, but it's not entirely clear. Let's think a bit about the context. This poem is part of The Hawk in the Rain, a collection of 40 poems published in 1957, which focuses, as its title suggests, on the world of nature and animals, but it also includes poems like this, Bayonet Charge. This poem is set presumably in the First World War, although it could really apply to any war with bayonet charge. But it's important to note that Hughes himself never experienced war firsthand. He never fought directly. He was a child during the Second World War and therefore wasn't alive during the First. However, he was a part of that post-war generation whose lives were completely altered by these wars and who witnessed the immensity of their impact. Now, Ted Hughes' father fought in the First World War, and he was one of the few survivors of the Lancaster Fusiliers in the Gallipoli campaign. He was, like many, deeply traumatised by the horrors of what he had seen, and he carried that emotional burden for the rest of his life. Hughes would have therefore seen firsthand the psychological impact of the war and how it can burden the soldiers long after the war itself ends. It therefore makes sense that Hughes would seek to explore this experience that he had never had, but the impact of which he had witnessed so acutely through poetry. Bayonet Charge acts in a similar way to Owen's poetry, never seeking to glorify war, but rather to expose its terrible brutality. Let's have a closer look at the poem. It's quite an abrupt opening to the poem. We're alerted immediately to action with the adverb suddenly, and was running. This is an opening that plunges the reader or listener into the action. There's a Latin term we use for that. Do you know it? It's what we call in medias res, which is a Latin phrase meaning literally in the middle of things. It plunges the reader into the action. And I always wonder what it means suddenly he awoke and was running. Does it mean that he was asleep before? Probably not really. But it does capture that sense, when you are jolted awake suddenly and it's very unpleasant. It captures that sense of when you are jolted abruptly awake. It shows how this entrance to the battle is quite a rude awakening. In raw seamed khaki, obviously, that's what he's wearing. You have that repetition of the word raw. And for me, that word raw, it has connotations of injury, of when something is sore and swollen, and perhaps indicates the state of the soldier, that he is feeling raw in the face of this battle. And his sweat is metaphorically heavy, and he stumbles towards a green hedge. Notice throughout there is a contrast, and we see it definitely later with the hair. There's a contrast between the natural world and the violent world of battle, or the violence of humanity. There's a lot of mentions of green here. Towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire. Would you expect rifle fire to go with a verb like dazzled? No. So what do we have there? We have juxtaposition. The juxtaposition between a word connoting beauty, the word dazzled. If you're dazzled by something, you are struck by it in a very positive way. Something is dazzling, it's glowing, it's beautiful, and that's juxtaposed by the violence of the rifle fire. As usual, it's not enough just to point these methods out, you must then discuss the effect of those methods. So what does that juxtaposition do? It adds to the sense of confusion of battle. That's interesting, bullets smacking the belly out of the air, that personification, that metaphor of essentially the air being winded, which feels contradictory because how can the air itself be winded? But it's showing the power of the bullets. And it describes the rifle he's lugging as a smashed arm, an unwanted part of the soldier. It is a part of him in the same way that a limb is part of somebody. But if it's smashed, it's unwanted. So the simile paints the gun as a limb, an unwanted part of the soldier. And you have this wonderful metaphor moving onto a simile here. Patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. So that metaphor / simile captures the change in perspective of the soldier when faced with war. What once had moved him to tears, his patriotism, his pride of his country, that disappears. And in the heat of battle, it becomes more like molten iron, a lava-type substance sweating from the centre of his chest, his heart itself. It's a really powerful image to capture that dissipating patriotism. Dissipating means dissolving, disappearing, which we'll see later as well when he describes them dropping like luxuries, but we'll come back to that. In bewilderment then, he almost stops. You have this moment when the soldier pauses as much as he's able and he contemplates his own role in this war. And you have this incredible rhetorical question: in what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? This metaphor, it casts him as a cog in the machine of war. He is advancing in the unstoppable way that a clock ticks second by second. And the harsh alliteration of cold clockwork reminds us of the cruelty of this, the cruelty of the powerlessness of his situation of just being this cog in a machine. Remember, if you want to get higher marks, those level 5 or level 6 marks, you want to add layers to your interpretation. And actually, if you can have more than one interpretation that builds and feeds off another interpretation, that makes your answer a lot stronger and a lot more likely to get into those level 5, level 6 marks. So in this, we've got, yes, the metaphor casts the soldier as a cog in the machine, but also the connection to time and the countdown. It reminds of the imminent end of life, perhaps, for the soldier. It reminds of the countdown of the soldiers' lives, that the seconds are ticking away to their death, potentially. So that could be another layer of interpretation you add on top of that. It evokes a countdown leading to death. Be another layer of interpretation you add. He was running like a man who was jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running. You have a lot of enjambment here, and that enjambment, it mirrors his running, trickling over, and adds to the sense of momentum that he can't stop. And everyone knows that idea of running, when you're running either away or towards something and panicking. That's a feeling that I think a lot of people can relate to. Listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running. He's questioning his role in the war again. He's thinking, what's the reason for his running? Why is he running? Well, it's because of the war. It's because he's a soldier. It's because he's powerless over his actions. He's been ordered to go over the top and to charge, and that is what he has to do. He's wondering why he's doing it. He's wondering what is leading him to run. Why is he this second hand ticking? This is a really interesting image here. His foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. Statuary means statues. So it's almost like him freezing. You have that image of him freezing, or time freezing, because this time is quite central to this stanza. Frozen statue, perhaps even frozen by fear. Then the slot-slashed furrows, a lot of sibilant sound there, and it's actually quite difficult to say. It's quite a tongue twister. In fact, this whole poem is quite difficult to recite. And that's intentional because that is reflecting the difficulty of the battle. I stumble over it, then the shot slashed furrows, then the slot slashed furrows threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle. It's quite challenging to get those lines out. Notice also here, in speaking of enjambment, you have an enjambment that runs across stanzas. So the enjambment, remember, enjambment is when a line of poetry runs to the next line of poetry. Here it doesn't just run to the next line of poetry, it runs across a stanza break. And that has quite a jarring effect. It's quite disconcerting. It makes you stop when you're looking at the poem on the page. Again, reflecting the chaos of the war. And then this return to nature. We talked about the green hedge earlier. You now have this yellow hair that rolled like a flame. That cruel simile showing the natural world as burning. And crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide open, silent. What do you think this hair is meant to symbolise? Really, it could be a symbol of the suffering in war, especially since, and this is why I think it has such an impact on the soldier seeing this hair thrown up. The hair is a reminder of the innocent casualties and the collateral damage of the war. It's an innocent animal, and a hare is quite a magical creature in nature in terms of its speed, in terms of how fast it's meant to be. And they're quite rare to see as well, hares. It's part of fables like the hare and the tortoise. And it's a reminder of the innocent casualties and collateral damage. And using a hare, which is quite a magical creature, it drills that message home more. And this idea of its mouth wide open silent almost makes it seem like it's a human screaming in silence. Quite a disturbing image, this hare. And he plunges past again towards the green hedge. Green hedge is repeated. Remember that contrast between the natural world of the hare and the greenery and the violence of the rifles and the war and the battle. And these are really wonderful lines. King, honour, human dignity, etc. Because using that etc. afterwards, it belittles what comes before it by saying, oh, etc. It's dismissing then king, honour, human dignity. These things that are quite big, especially as a soldier in war. You think you're fighting for your king and country. You're fighting for honour and you're trying to maintain your dignity. But all of that, no, that's belittled in war. It falls into a list of etceteras that doesn't really matter, and they drop like luxuries, as it says. The king, honour, human dignity, that links back to the patriotic tier that's mentioned in stanza 1. And this dropped like luxuries. And that simile highlights how values and beliefs are reduced to luxuries in the heat of battle, how it is nearly impossible to hold on to these beliefs and values when confronted by the horrors of war. To think that they just become something that's a luxury, they're not a necessity in battle. In fact, they become next to impossible in battle. They drop, they fall away. It's impossible to maintain conviction and belief when confronted by the horrors of war. And they're yelling him to get out of that blue crackling air, so his instinct is telling him to get away from the battle. His terror's touchy dynamite. And that metaphor conveys the explosive nature of his fear. He's surrounded by explosions going off, and they are suffusing his fear itself. They're making his fear into something explosive. He plunged past with his bayonet toward the green hedge. It mentions that he's going toward the green hedge at the beginning. So we assume he's not running away from the battle. But actually, this idea of everything dropping like luxuries and all that he wants in that moment is to escape. And can we blame him? It's not entirely clear whether he's running towards or away. Because it describes in the first stanza that he's also running towards the green hedge, we assume he's just carrying on with the charge. But actually, he doesn't want to be. Yeah, he wants to be running for his life. That is his natural instinct in the chaos and struggle of the battle around him. In terms of its structure, This poem doesn't have a specific rhyming scheme or metre. It's therefore what we call free verse. And its somewhat chaotic structure, the unpredictability evoked by the constants, enjambment, caesures, and dashes, mirrors the chaos and unpredictability of war. You even have enjambment across a stanza break, which is quite jarring. The fragmentation of this poem reflects the confusion and disjointed experience of the soldier. So, which poems could you compare it to? An obvious comparison would be Charge of the Light Brigade. The title of both even contains the word charge, because both depict soldiers advancing, both start in medias res or in the middle of the action, and both seem to criticise these wars, even though this is less overt in Charge of the Light Brigade. Tennyson's poem does glorify the act of the soldiers, however, but Hughes conveys the terror and isolation of a single soldier when overwhelmed by the horror and reality of battle. You could compare it to Exposure because both are very negative portrayals of war, and both question the ideas of patriotism and duty that drive the soldiers. However, Bayonet Charge is full of action, whereas Exposure is distinct for its lack of action. How the weather that is freezing the soldiers to death is more of an enemy. Also, one must consider that Owen did experience war firsthand, and his poems document that experience. Hughes, on the other hand, never experienced war, so his poem is an imagining of the horrors of war. Finally, you could compare it to Remains because both explore the psychological impact of war on the soldiers. Remains focuses more on the aftermath of conflict for this soldier, however, as he confronts his own guilt and trauma, especially after having become somewhat desensitized to violence, whereas Bayonet Charge is a snapshot of the war's action and relays the experience of this soldier in the moment of this charge. I hope this helped develop your understanding of the poem. It is a fast-paced poem about an isolated soldier's inability to escape the terrors surrounding him. Like Owen, it highlights the horror of the reality of war.